Who is the most dangerous person you've ever met? I had a guy in my scout platoon in Afghanistan that was the calmest operator I saw 10 years in. He was the coldest, calmest guy under fire I've ever seen. Never batted an eye, even under heavy fire or ambushes. I never heard him raise his voice, which is very rare for an NCO leading Joes. We were on patrol one day, heard the typical snap bang of a sniper taking a round at us. He whirls with his M4 and fires, dropping a guy off a rooftop with a single round. Just as calm as anything, he comes over the net to me. B2, this is B4. One enemy KIA. Like he was ordering at a drive-thru. I saw him do that and many other things that would send most people barking mad up a tree, but he was just as cold and calm as if he were at a picnic. I'm convinced that man was born to do the job he was in. Beware the quiet ones. Story 2. I have an extended Italian family that started a construction business, and they always said they had no ties whatsoever to the mafia. When my mother was a teenager, they went to Florida for vacation in the 60s. Some guy who was staying at the hotel tried to SA my mother. My mother managed to escape and let everyone know, and that was the end of the story. When my grandfather passed away at the funeral, my mom's uncle approached my mother and me and said to my mother, "Do you still remember that trip to Florida? What that man did to you? Your father had that boy's legs broken." I just wanted to tell you that. We were shocked, but it made us question the connections since they were visiting from Canada and a phone call was made and people showed up to the hotel to break his legs. There must have been connections. Story 3. I did the summer work in Alaska thing, and we were drinking in a bar and met this local dude who took us out to his boat and then went nuts and started telling us to get off his boat or he'd end us in the middle of the sound. And he started throwing his own crap off the boat, and then he started crying and went back to the dock. And when we told the local cops, they said, "Yeah, you need to avoid Clayton. Dude is in and out of API for violent crap all the time." We were lucky no one got hurt. Story 4. I worked in a challenging and violent behaviors unit when I worked in a care home. One of our clients was once called by the Daily Record the most dangerous man in Scotland. He didn't seem dangerous to me. Then I read his care file, and I started reminding everyone he was supposed to have two-person supervision at all times, and we all got super slack about that. And I got told I was being silly, but that was all years ago. I refused to work with him without a partner present. Some of the other care workers backed me, some didn't. Then there was an accident, and let's just say that nobody was making fun of me after that, and everyone wanted a partner with them when working with them. Story 5. A paratrooper from World War II. The man was in demolition and obstacle clearing. He was training in high explosive creations and applications. He could build a with the contents of an average kitchen that could level a house, and had done so. He was a chemical engineer pre-World War II. He had survived D-Day on a glider as part of the Pathfinders unit. He survived the Battle of the Bulge. He once said, "I know for sure that I put 43 men in their grave, but it's likely more. So I owe that to any god up there." He could never watch Saving Private Ryan all the way through. The knife duel at the end of the movie was too real, as he had been in that kind of situation more than once and came out the survivor. He was in his 80s when I met him, and he was still a terrifying force to reckon with. Story 6. Probably my ex-best friend. I learned his dad was high up in a supremacist group, and that's why he was being housed by a foster family along with his little sister. He didn't support their beliefs at all, and I did not communicate with his dad. He opened up about how he struggled with a previous serious substance abuse issue. However, he was sober when I met him, and all throughout our time as friends. He was a good person, when I was hanging out with him at least. Very street smart, honest, and a great listener, and he cared for others very deeply. The type of person who would give you the shirt off his back. He saved our lives from getting attacked in an alley one night by being hyper aware of the people taking an interest in us while I was oblivious. I grew up super sheltered. I thought he wanted better for himself out of this life, and it seemed like it at first. I met my now ex-wife, and I started to see how he was around her, and I did not like him being near her. Crude comments, weird remarks, etc. Just gross. Not like how I knew him at all. So I cut him off. He was mad, but I didn't like what I was seeing or who he was becoming. And I loved her more. 5 years later, I learned he was involved in the passing of a homeless person in San Francisco a year after I cut him off. He and his buddies did it. What's wild is he reached out to me after he did that, but before he was gone, asking for a place to stay. But I said no. I just had a feeling he was bad news at that point, and I was right. Story 7. My dad. My sister was attacked by a boyfriend. I knew the guy pretty well and counted him a friend, and my sister and I are really close. I was livid and convinced I'd harm him. Fast forward to an argument between me and my mother about it. She refused to let me leave the house, and my dad, who's super gentle and silent, mind his own business kind of guy, just sits there. I started getting into him for being a coward and not doing anything. I said some pretty horrific things, and the next thing I know, I'm on my back looking at the ceiling. It was the only time my dad ever hit me. So I've got a bag of peas on my chin, mom looking after me, and dad is gone. He was out for 12 hours and came home late at night. He never said a word about where he'd been. I get a call the following afternoon. The ex-boyfriend got jumped behind the bar he worked at. Apparently, 4 people with metal bars beat him so badly, he spent 4 months in the hospital to recover. When he walked out of the hospital, he was paid a visit by a random person, went home, packed his belongings, and flew overseas that night. I've never seen or heard of him since. Dad worked in construction and knew a fair few tough individuals. I still don't have any of the story from him directly. He just says, "I'll tell you when you're older." I'm now 45. The man just smiles and says, "I'll tell you when you're older." Story 8. My dad. I was sitting in the front seat of the car with my dad during a swap-off with my mom and her new husband. I didn't want to get out of the car, so I was sitting there. My dad was trying to calm me down, so the swap-off was taking a little bit longer than usual. Well, my mom's husband walked over to the car, opened the door, proceeded to grab my arm and try to pull me out of the car. The moment I saw my dad taking his seatbelt off and reaching to his hip, I already knew what was about to happen. He pushed me back with his hand and told me to close my eyes. All I saw was a large firearm appear, and he put it right between that man's eyes and told him he would severely injure him if he ever messed with me again. From that moment on, I knew that my dad was a very dangerous man, especially if you messed with his kids. Not to mention he's a Marine, a tough individual. Story 9. A boy. I was younger than him. He invited me to a party, his brother's birthday. It turned out it was not a McDonald's kind of party, but rather a wild bash. He was giving me juice laced with vodka. Very small amounts, but I got dizzy without noticing. He started acting inappropriately outside and then took me inside. He led me to a small room away from the party and pushed me on the bed. I was struggling and pushing back. My friend from school noticed outside that something was not okay, so he came searching. My mom came shortly after. It was 9 p.m., and it was the first and last time I missed my curfew. I was unharmed, nothing bad happened. It was many years ago. He was the most dangerous person I have met, to me, because I was unprepared. From that moment on, I was. Story 10. I was at the bar at an upscale Italian restaurant owned by a friend. I'd be there 3 or 4 nights a week. This guy, alone, was sitting there. The owner seemed to know him, so he struck up a conversation. Just small talk. He was great to interact with, had a good sense of humor, and we both ended up eating at the bar instead of at separate tables. After a long wine and grappa-soaked evening, it was time to say goodnight. So I told him I hoped to see him again soon. I enjoyed his company. He just smiled and said it was nice to meet me too. He surrendered to police the next morning. It turns out I was sitting with a contract operative the whole night. He worked for the biggest crime family in the city and was responsible for 3 deaths a week earlier and knew the police were looking for him. The next time I saw my friend, the owner, I asked him if he knew. He knew, and he said his friend told him to thank me again for joining him for his last meal. This happened in Montreal. Story 11. My father. Thankfully, he passed away 10 years ago. He was a convicted violent criminal with multiple offenses. My mom was a teenager when he met her. He was significantly older. This was before the internet. She didn't find out what a terrifying person he was until she was an adult, married to him and pregnant with me. He stalked us for years. He held us captive for 3 days when I was a child because he was mad my mom tried to escape. We'd fled the state, but he found us. During those 3 days, he severely injured my mom. It's honestly a miracle she survived the severity of his attack. Her ear was seriously injured, and she could no longer have children after what he did. I witnessed it. We ended up changing our names and moving a roughly 24-hour drive away with nothing but the clothes on our backs after she healed from that attack. She chose a 3-strike state since he had enough violent felonies that he wouldn't risk coming there. I almost chose not to have children because so many of my half-siblings are like him, violent criminals. I was scared I'd be cursing a child to be evil. I waited until my late 30s to have kids as a result. My mom grew up down the road from Ted Bundy. She met him a few times as a kid. She said he was unsettling, but she couldn't explain why back then. Story 12. I was in Bosnia on a charity trip from university, and basically, long story short, my friends and I made friends with the town's main influential figure, whom all the local police flashed their lights at as a mark of respect. He drove us all up a mountain once, and my boyfriend genuinely thought he was going to harm us, but he just wanted us to see the views. He did a birthday party for my friend and me and got some of his associates to bring us cake. He had a baseball bat in his car, and once I teasingly asked if he enjoyed playing, and he snickered. Yeah, Bosnian baseball. He was clearly a very dangerous character, but lovely to us. I blame my ADHD for this and many other ill-thought-out friendships and decisions I've made in my 20s and beyond. Story 13. This is minimal compared to others here, but my husband used to work with a guy who was former high-ranking military. The man was super regimented and never went off his routine. Turns out, jumping out of helicopters into enemy territory will do that to you. Or maybe it was when him and his team took an inflatable craft into a country the US wasn't supposed to be in the middle of the night. The need for routine might also come from his time spent in Nowhere, Australia, sending out drones in between weekly supply airdrops. When my husband was injured on the job, the guy basically saved his hand because of his medic training. The man has been a civilian for decades, but the military still owns him. He can talk about the previously mentioned stories because in a military sense, they are very outdated. But he's tight-lipped on a lot. Definitely a person I'd want on my zombie survival team. Story 14. At the time, he wasn't what I would consider dangerous by any stretch, but over time, one of my old friends developed some serious mental health issues. Almost out of nowhere thinking he was God and all that grandeur nonsense. I want to say a few weeks into it, he tried to seriously harm his Tinder date. She survived, thankfully, but he was fatally injured by the police because he wouldn't stop resisting. That end result was a far cry from the man I knew years before that, but I would easily consider him the most dangerous person I've been close to. Story 15. This is a regular customer at work. He speaks to what I assume is his spouse like she's a child. Put that back. It's $4 more. We can't get that. You get the cheap stuff and that's it. Go on, get something. Are you getting something? Do it now. Hurry up. Meanwhile, she looks constantly scared. At one point, he tried to get my attention and I didn't hear him. So he had to repeat himself and he did not like that. He grabbed my work equipment, cart, from me, shaking it, trying to push it into me, yelling, "If you don't want to work, then don't work." I'm 99% sure he's physically and verbally abusive towards her at home. He had zero problem trying to hurt me in public for not hearing him once. Story 16. A neighborhood kid I hung out with sometimes would just snap every now and then. He was a latchkey kid from kindergarten, so by the time we were in 6th grade, he was acting completely unrestrained. We were at his house playing with his Lionel train set on the dining room table. He starts talking about his mom, who passed away before he was 3. He's talking about her passing and goes to a desk and pulls out a weapon from the drawer. He leans over and presses it against me and says, "I think she passed away like this." Then he starts laughing and pulls out the loaded magazines as he's doing a proper clearing procedure on the weapon. I left immediately and never hung out with him again. We Gen X kids pretty much ran wild from 5th grade until high school graduation. Story 17. I was on a recent trip to Istanbul at the rooftop bar of the Swiss Hotel on the Bosphorus. I like upscale rooftops, so I took an Uber out there just to get up there and have a drink. As soon as I got up there, I noticed these very large security guards all strategically positioned at corners of the rooftop, scanning the entire area, completely alert. It was about 1 a.m. at the time. And these guys were huge. I'm a big guy myself, over 215 pounds and 6 feet tall, but these guys were bigger. The smallest was 6 feet 4 inches. The one that really stood out though was massive. Easily 6 feet 8 inches to 6 feet 10 inches. Square jaw, thick neck, pure muscle from head to toe. He was so muscled that you could see the outlines of his physique through a very poorly fitting jacket. It was a bit chilly, even though this was in May. The jacket was poorly fitted, probably because he had at least one weapon underneath it. Very rugged looking, like he had been on some special forces military team and seen actual combat or something of that nature. Like I said, I'm a big person, not easily intimidated, but this guy looked like and gave off the vibe that he could easily incapacitate someone with his bare hands. And by someone, I mean me. The thing was, he didn't even look particularly mean or anything. He would crack the occasional smile when he went over to talk to one of the other guys for a second or two before returning to his post. But everything about him said, "If you cross me, I am highly capable of neutralizing the threat." I have never felt like that before in my entire life, and I still don't know what or who was on that rooftop that required that level of security. Story 18. I think my wife's coworkers think I'm insane. There was this doctor who was pestering her. One day I went to visit her and bring lunch. I was hanging out with her on her lunch break, and as it ended, I was walking past his office, so I stopped in and said hi. Normal chit-chat, until he said something like, "You're lucky to have such a beautiful wife." I said, "I love her more than anything. There isn't a thing I wouldn't do to protect her. I regularly visit deep, secluded areas where a person could easily disappear. Anyway, have a good day." She came home and asked what I talked to her boss about. She said he's been weird and won't make eye contact with her. I said nothing really, just about duck hunting. Story 19. I'm no tough guy, but I'm not usually afraid of people. I've met a handful, and one stands above the rest. This friend of mine had a neighbor who moved into a rental house directly across the street of him, directly after release from an 8-year prison sentence on parole. We'll call him John, because that was his actual name. John had been in jail for an offense during a transaction that turned violent. That's all hearsay, but given the context, I'm pretty sure it's true. John quickly set up his operations and made buddies with my friend. We were a bunch of young troublemakers, so his type gravitated to us, and vice versa. This guy was pretty muscular, around 230 to 250 pounds, tatted neck to calves, a Caucasian man with dental adornments. I met him a month or so after he moved in. The 3 or so times I went to his house, he had a shotgun and a large amount of cash on his coffee table in the living room. A very aggressive Rottweiler, mostly confined to the backyard on a chain, and this devious charm that just screamed, "Don't provoke me." Within a couple of months of living there, he had gifted my friend a Buick LeSabre and a motorcycle to help him run contraband. Several stories came out of their brief time together. One was that they were both on a local state highway on their bikes, both with backpacks full of contraband and cash, when lights went up behind them for speeding, about 2 to 3 miles from John's house. My friend says he panicked and slowed down, but John accelerated and just took off, and the cops sped past in pursuit. My friend took the next exit and some back roads to get home, about a 10-minute drive. He said by the time he pulled up, John had fully cooked a bowl of ramen noodles he was eating casually on the couch. In, I want to say, 4 to 6 months, SWAT showed up at his house, took him away, and we never heard from him again. Shortly after that, lucky for him, my buddy had gotten into a small confrontation with him and had to give the bike and the car back, so nothing fell on him. But yeah, I'll never forget thinking, yeah, I'm not going to provoke him. Story 20. I traveled to New Zealand in 2012. Out drinking, I met this guy who was completely reckless, taking drinks off the table that people ordered. Being 21 and intoxicated, it was hilarious to me. Looking back, he was very sociopathic with others at the bar. There was a news piece about cars being damaged by explosions, just something you see and go, damn, that sucks. We cut to 1 a.m. at a different spot. I ran into that guy again. He'd been talking my ear off at the previous post, so I was pretty done talking to him. He's spouting off random nonsense, and I realized he's kind of crazy, so I just start agreeing with him. All of a sudden, he goes, "I like you. Do you want to come with me to detonate a vehicle?" I'm like, what? You know. He makes the sound a 6-year-old would make up an explosion with hand gestures and everything. I was intoxicated and almost agreed to it. I had a sober moment of realizing I'm in a foreign country. I left. The next morning, his picture with a "Have you seen this man?" as a caption was on TV. If you're enjoying this video, don't forget to hit that subscribe and like button for more videos like this. Story 21. A patient in the ER. He came in telling the triage nurse that he was so angry that he was afraid he would hurt someone. He got put in a room awaiting a conversation with a doctor. I walked in about 30 minutes later, finding him standing on the bed ready to pounce at the first person that entered. This guy was large as a gorilla, with obvious signs of extreme agitation. I managed to slam the door in his face and just ran down the hallway. Security came in mid-sprint and tackled him, which turned into the worst scuffle I've seen, involving him, 3 security guards, and another patient about his size. They all managed to restrain him until the police arrived. It took 3 patrol cars to get him out. One of the security guards broke an arm, and the patient had to stay overnight because of head trauma. I later learned that he had been involved in a fatality some years earlier. I haven't really thought much about it, to be honest. The ER was a wild place, and this was just one of many stories from the 10 years I worked there. Story 22. Years ago, I ran a marketing company, and we had this sort of sales arm of a chain of high-end resorts in Mexico as a client. We did a bunch of online recruitment for them to basically help them hire timeshare salespeople, and we did so well that my partner and I got invited down for a meeting with the boss. The man was 6'6", former Serbian intelligence officer and organized crime figure whose former business partner had an accidental, fatal fall from a balcony. He just had the hardened eyes of someone who had seen and been the cause of great harm. Sitting across from him in his dimly lit basement office was genuinely the most intimidating experience of my entire life. The man ended up loving us and our work though, and signed a huge new contract with us on the spot. So my business partner and I proceeded to go on the biggest, most fun celebration of my life. It actually ended up being a pretty fantastic experience in the end. Story 23. My dad knew some really crazy people when I was growing up. One time at a diner, he had a friend come over who was fresh out of prison. He was an Arab guy named Bassam. He was a scary-looking guy, partially bald, scars on his face, and a full set of gold teeth in the front. Bassam was a contract operative. He told me a story about how he once carried out a targeted attack on a man in a park in Montreal. He said he knocked the guy down to the pavement with the butt of a firearm. Then, at very close range, he shot the man. The resulting splatter was severe enough that it reached his face. Story 24. Years ago, my dad was a big drinker, so I spent a lot of time in pubs or waiting around while he got intoxicated. In typical barfly fashion, he'd often strike up a conversation with his fellow alcoholics. When I was maybe 11, the family drove across Nullarbor, a vast area of empty land stretching across the guts of Australia. We stopped in some small town in the middle of nowhere. Dad got talking to Mick. This is sounding a little Wolf Creek-like, but it's legit. Anyway, Mick oozed volatility. Even at my young age, I had all sorts of alarm bells ringing in my brain, though I was unable to articulate them at the time. He just had this violent, unpredictable energy about him. Anyway, I sat on a bar stool doing my best to follow along with the increasingly impaired back and forth. Eventually, Mick revealed that it was his first drink since getting out of prison. I'll never forget this part of the otherwise hazy conversation. Dad, prison? Not our happy-go-lucky Mick. Mick. Yeah, happy-go-lucky until he comes home from work to find his wife with another man, and then went on to explain in great detail how he inflicted a severe fatal harming on the guy with his bare hands. At this point, the alarms were ringing in my ears. I had this cold feeling. It felt like the emotional equivalent of a cat that doesn't want to be picked up, just mentally searching to find a way out of the conversation. But I was powerless. Within the same hour, some police walked in. His demeanor shifted suddenly. The volatility grew serious legs. He immediately took to antagonizing them. I remember that being the moment where I made the connection that he must have hated police because of his previous interactions with them. Obvious as an adult, but really jarring to witness as a kid. He really went after them verbally, calling them pigs and an onslaught of other nasty things within seconds of them walking in. They were incredibly patient with him, but it was like he wanted to go back to prison, sidestepping their courtesies and finding new ways to be antagonistic towards them. Dad didn't deem it time to leave until Mick threw the first punch at the police. He struck one of them hard. He was wrestled to the ground and arrested in this huge scene. It sucked all of my energy out of the bar. He was still screaming when they cuffed him, struggling to get free and telling them he was going to seriously harm them. I've never felt so unsafe around a human being in my life, and that feeling found new heights with every minute that passed. You know, a couple of years ago, I mentioned on Reddit how I spent so many nights sitting in a car in the car park waiting for hours for my dad to return from the bar, to intoxicatedly drive us both home. It was only the sympathetic replies of Redditors that made me see it as that big a deal. It just felt normal to me. Writing this reply, I'm realizing just how many ways my dad's drinking put me in harm's way, made me feel unsafe, and exposed me to things kids really shouldn't have had to hear or see. At no point had I ever seen this as my dad being a terrible parent, but I definitely see it now. Story 25. An old friend of mine. He just got back from his 5th tour in the Middle East. He had quite a few mementos. About 6 months after he finished his contract, we met up for drinks. Late that night, he wanted to find a street worker. I jokingly said I couldn't afford that. His response was, "Don't worry about it, I'll take care of her afterwards. No one will know but the deal." I could tell by his tone and blank face that he was serious. I changed the subject quickly, and the night went on. I talked to him about it a few nights later with some of his comrades. He went and got help, but I know the devil is in there, just waiting for a reason, for justification. Story 26. I was working in a hospital a few years ago, and there was an elderly patient I'd grown fond of, as we used to share a laugh and have a joke with each other. The only thing was he always had a police guard outside of his room, but I didn't know what it was for the time, and it wasn't unusual to see it. I found out he was the main aggressor in a bank robbery 20 years before, and had caused multiple fatalities in the process of the robbery. Safe to say, I kind of backed off once I learned the truth. Story 27. A coworker at Domino's when I was working there during the 80s. He had spent a year or so in prison for financial fraud down the East Coast. He and I formed a friendship, but he was unstable. I was driving one time, and some students at the college thought it would be fun to tailgate us and scream stuff out the windows. No reason. We hadn't had a run-in with them, and I don't drive under the speed limit. I stopped the car and let him get out. He walked back to their car and put the fear of God in them. He was a big, imposing guy and wouldn't think twice about walking into violence. In this one particular case, it was funny because they apologized for being rude and no violence occurred. I realized he was a genuinely bad guy when he approached me with an idea to try to talk his father into paying us $5,000 to harm some guy his father hated. I thought he was joking at first, but when I realized he wasn't, I told him no way. After that, I stopped hanging out with him. I looked him up on Facebook, then blocked him without making contact a few years ago to see if he was alive and out of prison. Apparently, he didn't carry out the severe act, or he got away with it. Story 28. Well, I met and hung out with someone a few times in a group setting. Eventually, he was dating a friend of mine. I ended up having to stay at his place on a freezing cold night after we'd all been drinking. This was before rideshares and Ubers. He was becoming increasingly aggressive with his advances. I kept rebuffing him. Eventually, I was pushing him off and yelling, and I won't get into it further, but he was able to overpower me. It was not looking good until his roommate walked in. He saved my life, honestly. If he hadn't intervened, I believe I would have been severely violated. I also met a few individuals involved in organized crime who had definitely caused several accidents. Nobody dangerous and famous though. Story 29. I once sat on the train station waiting for my train. A guy sat down a few seats ahead of me eating his sandwich. He laid down the sandwich for a few seconds when a pigeon tried to steal it. I don't remember every detail of what happened exactly. I only know that the man started screaming like a total monster and violently harming the pigeon. There was a traumatic mess everywhere. People started running, screaming, and the police came 2 minutes later. I was so shocked I couldn't move for several minutes, just silently crying since birds are my favorite animals. I needed a whole year to get over it. Story 30. My first boss out of college. He was a quiet man, very professional, but there was something always behind his eyes. I figured out he was always scanning. He was a retired Navy SEAL in the 90s who saw combat, but he never talked about it, nor did I press the matter. He did tell me that he had to go through buds twice because he broke his arm on the second to the last day of Hell Week. He didn't want to quit, but they made him because, broken arm. He was one of the best mentors I've had in my almost 20-year career. Story 31. Not meant, but I live in a condo. Houses are kind of close. A new neighbor moves to the house that borders the back of mine. He had a dog that wouldn't stop barking. I was going crazy. I complained to the HOA manager. Some days passed by and the dog was barking non-stop. I called the HOA and they told me that they tried to reach out to the neighbor. The guy was actually renting the place. Well, turns out he was the leader of a small criminal group who made the news because he was taken and terminated by a rival group. They filmed everything and made it available on social networks. The poor dog was abandoned, hence the barking. It's a good thing I didn't complain directly to the guy. Story 32. I met someone through an event that got really close to my friend. They started spreading rumors and making me look like I was the unstable monster, when in reality I was reacting to a lot of the bad behavior that this person was putting me through. I'd find out later that they joined in on this plot to accuse me of things I didn't do or use my reactions as proof that I was toxic and unstable. Mostly to get me out of the picture because I started to see through their lies and recognize that they were a narcissist. This individual legitimately sought to inflict harm on me, arrange for my arrest, or even end my life, which I found out after putting much distance between that person and myself, and was practically handed screenshots from a group chat about it. I've been around some scary situations, but dealing with that scared me the most because this person would have driven me to hurt myself if they succeeded. Story 33. Everyone who has ever been my boss in a professional setting. It greatly concerns me that one person can have so much power over other people's lives. They can just wake up and decide to fire someone, and suddenly that person has no livelihood and could possibly end up in a difficult situation. I also feel like it takes a degree of selfishness to rise up the ranks in a company. So the types of people who become bosses are already the types of people who will prioritize themselves. Story 34. The last guy I dated. He told me he had a friend that wanted to know how it felt to take a person's life. Then he put water on the cable I was depending on from Half Dome. I didn't realize it at the time, but now it gives me the chills. I guess he thought I'd lose my grip and fall. But even though my gloves slipped, I was able to hang on. He did it with a water bottle he said he picked up as garbage left behind. When I looked around at him to tell him my gloves were slipping, he put the water bottle in a pocket of his pack and he was smiling. Story 35. After knowing someone for years and not knowing what should have been obvious has taught me to respect everybody. I met a man who appeared like an ordinary guy. After a couple of years of being around him, I learned he had zero emotions and had to learn how to regulate emotion and empathy by observing situations and other people's responses around him. He said his brain doesn't know how to handle a passing, but he knows how others respond and he will act accordingly. I also learned later that he was responsible for the severe and deliberate incidents of 6 people and was released from prison on a life sentence with 0% chance of parole. Not sure how long he's been out of prison, but he lives a good life with a job, a wife, a daughter, and a beautiful home. He now helps other people in prisons and jails and provides a positive support system. I'm a decent judge of character, and after he explained it, I started to notice how he observed others, and it's kind of scary that I missed it. I learned a lot. Story 36. My town has a lot of motorcycle gang-related organized crime activity, often factional conflict that spills out into real life. I went to school with a guy who is evil but too fearful to even carry out his own violent acts. He pays others to do his dirty work, which I think allows complete detachment from the act. Not legally, but emotionally, on a human level at least. He's also a serial offender. His parents hold normal jobs, but this guy and his sister are all wrapped up in this horrible lifestyle, have had children removed by authorities, had multiple charges, and are not good people. I would love to have been a fly on the wall of their childhoods to figure out just what caused them to become so troubled, honestly. Story 37. I had a coworker who seemed really weird and sort of gave me the creeps. One day the guy didn't show up for work. The boss calls me into his office and says that parole agents had arrested him for lying about getting a job. He wasn't supposed to be working. When they arrested him, he had firearms, explosive devices, and improvised explosive weapons in his apartment. He had been arrested previously on related charges. He was suspected of terminating his girlfriend and putting her in the desert about 2 years prior, although they could never prove those charges. The background check when he was hired exposed none of that. It was a major failure in the hiring process. A simple Google search of his name showed all of the prior court filings. Story 38. A childhood friend of mine. We were close and had a group of friends, but he'd be crazy sometimes. He owned lots of blades for a kid in 8th grade. Once he held one in my neck, and another friend's as well, and claimed it was a joke. We cut him off and tried to reunite years later. I know, stupid. And to make it worse, there was alcohol involved. I got in his car once because he wanted to show it to me, and he took off and told me he was planning on crashing into trees. We went at least 80 miles per hour heading towards an intersection before he slammed on the brakes. That was the last time I saw him, although he did reach out on Facebook about 6 months ago asking how I was. I didn't reply. Story 39. My uncle/stepfather. One of many Vietnam veterans every male in my family was. He was the 82nd Airborne. I saw him pull a firearm on people, seemingly by instinct, several times as a child. He had improvised explosive devices under the seat of his truck. He carried multiple firearms on his person all the time. We would go to his house and have a contest, as kids, on who could find the most weapons. Nobody ever discharged a weapon at anyone. He used a firearm to strike my sister's cruel father. He was a tough, rugged individual who was essentially the guy they called when there was a problem with any train, wrecks, breakdowns, etc., anywhere west of the Mississippi. Why? Because he commanded so much respect from any and all burly working men. If you've ever seen the types of men who work on trains, you'd know what I speak of. He could pluck trout out of the river with just his hands. I watched this many times, and have breakfast made in a matter of minutes. He grew up just below the Continental Divide in a tiny cabin with no water, no electricity, and no bathroom. Tollard, Colorado. He literally walked to school in 6 feet of snow, as they say. The guy walked into virtually any bar in Colorado, and people stood up straight and feared and respected this man. It was a sight to behold grown men speaking in nothing but yes sir, no sir, please, and thank you. He had zero tolerance for lack of manners or misbehaving from anyone, anywhere. He'd stop and help anyone, anywhere in trouble, whether carrying groceries, dealing with broken down cars, or intervening in domestic disputes, whatever. Just an immense figure in my life. Passed away much too young. I can't say enough about Mr. Golightly. I'm sure there's a lot here people don't agree with, but he was who he was during the time he was living. Just a model of a man and a true force of nature. Story 40. In 2001, my dad managed a hotel. He had a mild heart attack and was released on September 11th. A few days later, he was back to work because he was an alcoholic. The FBI came to see him at work, which nearly gave him another panic attack. The members who hijacked the plane that crashed in Pennsylvania stayed at the hotel, heading east in the weeks leading up to September 11. When he played back the video footage, they were checking in at the hotel. I walked up with dinner for my dad and was standing right next to them while I waited for him to finish checking them in. Story 41. Not famous, but when I was in my 20s, my neighbor was a seller of controlled substances. Mostly grass, which I liked, but other substances if you needed them. Nothing less than an ounce at a time. Not real weight, but not grams either. He was a rich club kid. Not dangerous. We were friends. Kind of. I met his connection once or twice, kind of a little bit more rough around the edges, but even still, that seemed an affectation. Anyway, at the time I had a beater pickup truck. My seller friend and his connection wanted to use it to pick up product, so I drove them. So, two up the ladder, these guys were real. I am not a tough individual, and I don't pretend to be one, but it's one thing to listen to music about criminal life, and it's another to go to a front restaurant where a guy has an automatic firearm in his hand, casually sort of sitting, watching the proceedings. Act or no act, that guy was ice cold looking. I am around a decade sober and much happier for it. These things are stupid and dangerous, and far less glamorous than you are led to believe. Story 42. I went to high school with a guy who was always kind and seemed really sweet. His family moved to the US from Iraq and Syria when he was a kid to try to escape the wars and dictators. About 3 to 4 years after high school, there was an incident and a manhunt for my classmate. He fatally injured his girlfriend's dad. The guy wanted to propose, and his girlfriend's dad refused his blessing because of religious differences. The guy was Muslim, and I think that dad was Catholic, but the local authorities said it was one of the most severe attacks they had seen in this area. My buddy saw the crime scene photo and said it was disturbing. He used a sword, a kitchen fork, and other objects in the attack. His first trial was a mistrial. In the second trial, he pleaded insanity and lost. He's spending life in prison. He always seemed so nice. It was so unexpected. Story 43. I won't do him the honor of naming his name. He was a prominent attorney who embezzled around $400,000 to $500,000 from his elderly clients. He was convicted, but out with an ankle monitor and staying with his mother. On the day he was set to report to prison, his mom makes him dinner and then he took her life. He cuts off his ankle monitor, steals her car, and then disappears for almost a year before they caught up with him. Huge ego. Seriously, he thought he was smarter than everyone else. He slept on my couch several times, but there was always something about him that gave me the feeling of unease. The last time he crashed there, something about him made the hair at the back of my neck stand up. I ended up texting my friend his name that night in case I disappeared. I played normal until he left, and then immediately after, I changed the locks in case he had found my spare key and made a copy. Anyway, he's serving multiple life sentences now. Good riddance. Society is surely a safer, better place without him. Well, if you like these stories, here's more. YouTube thinks you're gonna love this. Catch you in that video.